Hello, this is Peter Devine. I'm a fifth generation San Franciscan, go all the way back to Colonel Martinez and his family, and on the French side from the Vassar-Merle family, and on the Irish side from the Flavin, Devine families, and the Beretta family. So a lot of San Francisco history, and a lot of it's connected to this church, this building you're seeing, Saint Ignatius Church up on the Ignatian Heights hilltop. My family's been associated with the Jesuits in San Francisco since 1868, when my great-great-grandfather attended St. Ignatius when it was on Market Street. This is the new church built after the earthquake and fire, and you'll see it's all surrounded by the fog and the mists because St. Ignatius Church is built in one of the biggest areas of the fog with the towers that light up at night shining through. Okay, when the church was first built, Elise Robinson, in a national column for the Hearst newspapers, talked about how she looked across a deep valley, which was, in the city, a beautiful view of this hilltop that had once been cemetery land and pretty desolate. And all of a sudden, she saw these tall, gleaming spires of St. Ignatius, and she said it was a symbol of all that is the best and the bravest in the city. They were built on a hill on which they stand, which was once sand dunes, but as the city began to spread and the vision of men spread with it, out of that vision came these lovely spires. And they overlook the bay, they overlook the downtown of San Francisco, they overlook the Pacifica, and they look down to the San Bruno Mountains, so they pretty much cover 360 degrees of the beauty of the San Francisco area. So these towers over the bay, the Golden Gate and the Pacifica, are towers that inspire and aspire. And they're right in the heart of San Francisco at St. Ignatius Church. Here's a nighttime view of the current church as it was illuminated in 1989 after another San Francisco earthquake, and we'll get into that further on in the presentation. This is a view of the church from Twin Peaks, and you can see how the church towers over, and almost you have perpendicular, parallel towers on the Golden Gate Bridge. That circle that create the entrance to the bay. St. Ignatius is a destination church. It's a chapel for the University of San Francisco and for St. Ignatius College Prep. It is also a graduation destination for many other schools. And of course, it's the site of many famous weddings. As you can see, probably the most festive time of year is Christmas, when this church, which is really a beautiful landmark architecturally, shows itself off to its finest advantage. But it didn't start that way. Back in 1849, when San Francisco was just beginning to expand wildly with the gold rush and the early settlers who came here, the 49ers, two Jesuits arrived in San Francisco. They were from Oregon, and they arrived on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and you'll find that December 8th date comes up a lot during this history. They arrived in San Francisco because their congregations up in Oregon had left. As soon as they heard there was gold down in California, their towns all emptied out. They had nobody to serve anymore. So they asked permission from their local, authority, who was the head of the Jesuits in the West, could they travel down to San Francisco? And he said, of course, but please don't found any schools, don't start any churches, just go down to look and see what the need is. And of course, as we will find out, because mail service was so poor, sometimes people made decisions before they had permission. They assumed permission and then received the permission later. San Francisco, 1849. It's a small, tiny little town. And a lot of it's empty ships that landed here. Most of it was sand dunes. And you can actually see here in 1855, the original St. Ignatius started. But it wasn't the first Jesuit apostolate here. When they first got down here in 1849, Father Ricalti had written the Bishop of California, who was then in Monterey, and he had told them that he wanted them to work in the parishes, but he wanted one of the Jesuits to stay in San Francisco, one of the Jesuits to come down to the Santa Clara area. And so that Jesuit, Father Riccolti, went down to Santa Clara area, and he and the bishop, struck up such a good friendship and working relationship that the Bishop Alemany gave control of the mission Santa Clara to Father Riccolti, and he began the first Jesuit school, or what they used to call collegio, which meant 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, 4 years of high school, and some college. And that became what is the modern day University of Santa Clara. In San Francisco, one of the Jesuits who came a little bit later than Father Riccolti found this school that was going under. They had lost funding and they couldn't afford to keep the doors open. He thought this would be great. So he purchased it for $13,000 and tried to make a go of it. Unfortunately, the school went under, and it was on Dolores Street, and it was called the College of Sorrows because it lasted for only about 2 months. But finally, an Italian Jesuit named Father Anthony Maraschi arrived in San Francisco in 1854, again, close to the December 8th date, and Bishop Alemany was now stationed in San Francisco at Old St. Mary's, which was the cathedral. And he welcomed Father Maraschi and said, I would really like you to work at here at Old St. Mary's, but then I'd like you to work down at St. Patrick's on Market Street, and Market and Mission, pardon me. And so that was fine. Father Maraschi was down there. He said, but Bishop, I came here to found a Jesuit parish and school because that's what we do. And Bishop Alemany kept stalling and stalling because he was concerned that the Jesuits, because they were very popular preachers, would attract crowds and would take the income away from his parishes. So he kept, stalling him off, and finally one day he said, okay, and then he took his pen and pointed to a place on the map that was in the sand dunes, in the outer part of the city. By outer part of the city, we're talking 5th and Market, and by Powell, where in fact the Emporium department store was, and where now Bloomingdale's and Nordstrom's in the San Francisco Center is. That was the outskirts of town. And he said, you can build it there. Father Maraschi did not get upset with the fact that this was way out in the boonies, in the sand dunes. He decided this was perfect because, smart man that he was, he realized the city was only going to keep expanding and it would finally expand out to that area, and probably that would become more of a central area of the city. And sure enough, in the San Francisco map, as you can see here, 5th and Market is, further off. It was not considered central at that time. However, it eventually became, the center of San Francisco, and that was in what was called St. Anne's Valley. In 1855, on July 15th, a temporary wooden church opened. He had purchased the land from Thomas Larkin, whom Larkin Street is named for $11,500. The church in a single classroom building cost $4,000. The Jesuits slept in the classroom, so they didn't have the money to do anything else. But the church soon filled up. And the first day of classes, 3 students showed up, which wasn't exactly what they were hoping for. They hoped for larger numbers. But as their reputation as preachers and teachers began to grow, then all of a sudden, the College of Saint Ignatius, as it was called, started taking on more students. This is a sketch of the original 1855 classrooms and church building. Father Maraschi was an Italian Jesuit, and he was from the province of Turin. The province of Turin were missioned to the United States. And Father Maraschi was probably one of the most adventurous Jesuits who had been in several different Jesuit colleges in Europe and in the United States before he came to San Francisco. And people in San Francisco took great liking to this funny little Italian Jesuit who went out in the streets and walked around and did a lot of bargaining with people. There is a shrine to Father Morawski next to the bell tower at the current Saint Ignatius Church. And he basically took care of the university and the high school financially from its founding into the late 1880s and early 90s with his business plan for this apostle. Finally, 1863, the Jesuit parish had become so popular that it was packed to overflowing. So Father Morawski purchased the adjacent sand dune and commissioned a 500-seat brick church. He built two-story classroom building for the expanding elementary, high school, and college divisions, and the tuition was a whole $3 a year for middle school, $5 a year for high school, and $8 for the high collegiate classes. Now, keep in mind, in that economy, that was a fair amount of money. The enrollment had grown to 550 students in 8 years' time. That's from 3 students in September 1855 to over 550 8 years later. But the popularity caused a problem. Archbishop Alamany said, "You're too popular, and your property now is almost in the center of the city. So I want you to hand over the deed to the property to me, because I'm the bishop and I should own all the land." And the Jesuits said, "Well, no, we're a religious institute, and because we run a college, it's in our charter with canon law that we have to own the property and be financially responsible for it, and responsible for raising the funds for it." So the dispute went back and forth, and finally Rome ruled that no, the Jesuits were correct. It was their property. They didn't have to hand over the deed, but the archbishop was a little miffed at that. So he said, "Fine, then you can continue running the college and you can keep running the church as a chapel to the college, but the fact is you may no longer be a Catholic parish," which means no weddings, no funerals, none of those income generating services, sacramental services that parishes provide. Here's a sketch of the old church next to the new church, because they kept the old building and just continued with the new building. And you can see the brick next to the wooden structure. Here's an actual picture of it, okay, in the background in St. Anne's Valley. This is around 1860, where the original college was, and it expanded to 3 wooden buildings and then eventually to the brick structure. If you go down to Bloomingdale's store, you will see the original plaque by the San Francisco and California Historical Society that they put on the site of the original St. Ignatius College, okay? And this was done to memorialize where the original first college in San Francisco and in the immediate Bay Area was founded. Okay, it was originally under the rotunda at the Emporium department store, and then when that was torn down and Nordstrom's and Bloomingdale's were put in, it was installed, and it's right between the Nordstrom Bloomingdale's area in the mall. Here's the advertisement for the $8 and $5 for tuition at the campus, and this is from 1858. And here's an actual photograph of the original campus, the brick building of the second campus. Now, this became extremely popular. Of course, the Jesuits were heavily in debt at this time for all this construction, and they were slowly, starting to pay parts of it off. But then all of a sudden, Market Street got paved. And once Market Street got, paved over, now this became the center of town. And the property became very valuable. But that also was a problem because church properties could be taxed in those days, and the property tax was enormous on that property since it was right in the center of the shopping area. One day while walking, Father Morawski discovered a bell. It was the largest bell he'd ever seen, and in fact, it ended up being the largest bell manufactured up to that time. The San Francisco Volunteer Fire Department originally ordered it because San Francisco was so prone to fires. and they needed a big, loud bell to call the volunteer firemen to the scene of any fire that was starting to get out of control and run the risk of taking most of the city with it, which had happened several times. But unfortunately, the volunteer fire department, by the time the bell got here, they didn't have the money to pay for it. So Father Morawski said to the ship owner, do you really want to send it all the way back? You know, and well, no, they really didn't. The shipping costs alone would, you know, be a financial loss for the ship owner. So he was willing to sell it rather than send it back to England. And so Father Morawski started haggling with them, and one day he made an offer, the ship owner refused it. Next day, Father Morawski's out for a walk and praying his rosary, and he made another offer. And finally, after about 4 or 5 days, he got an offer that the ship owner was willing to accept. That was for $1,300. That bell has served in all 5 St. Ignatius churches. It still rings every day. And it's in the campanile at the current St. Ignatius Church. The third church, from 1855 through 1863, the school had expanded to 550. By 1880, it was close to 700 and 750. They were packed. And the church was overflowing. They had learned to bring out famous Jesuit preachers to preach what they call missions. And these missions were held in the evenings. And this is the day before television, radio, you know, internet, etc. So people would come out at night for a lecture. And these were devotional religious talks. And they brought some pretty powerful people in who are well known nationally. So this became, you know, a big center, and they realized the church had served its purposes. Plus, the property taxes now had become impossible to keep up with. It was just too expensive. So the Jesuits decided, okay, we're going to have to go further out in the city to land that's less expensive, so our taxes will go down, and we can sell this property to pay for the new property. So they saw a sand dune on the western outskirts of town at Hayes and Van Ness, the current site of Davies Symphony Hall. And they decided that they would build a big church basilica, a temple worthy of divine worship is the way they said it, and it would be the largest such basilica west, you know, of Chicago. They would also build the largest university, which they did. And this was St. Ignatius Church and College. Okay, it was on Van Ness and Hayes. The church was actually on Hayes Street with the high school and the college buildings adjoining it, as well as the Jesuit residence adjoining it. The front of the school was on Van Ness Avenue. And it became a model university. They had several very innovative Jesuit scientists there who were famous for their experiments in electricity and in neon and spotlights, etc. And so the university was considered one of the great universities for science, much bigger than UC Berkeley at that time, which was a smaller college across the bay. And so when uranium was discovered, samples were sent to 3 universities in the country: Harvard, Yale, and St. Ignatius. So this was one of the prime science laboratories in the country on this campus. You can see an actual photograph of it here and the surrounding area, which was still starting to be built up, okay? And here's another view of it, and you can see on the sides, oh, there's still a lot of sand dunes, or at least, you know, fenced off areas that had not been built yet. So this land was still not prime land, so the taxes were not that great. The church, however, was spectacular, as you can see, okay? It was a massive church. It seated 2,200 people. It was the only thing equivalent to that in terms of size nowadays would be the current St. Mary's Cathedral, which seats 2,400. Even Masonic Auditorium does not seat as many. And you can see it was done in a very Italianate style, a Baroque style, with all the stained glass windows, all the beautiful fresco work, and statuary pillars, and a spectacular front altar, which they would decorate very heavily for the different seasons. This is from the Golden Jubilee in 1905, when the Jesuits were celebrating their 50th anniversary in San Francisco. But you can see for different celebrations, here you have a Palm Sunday celebration. You can see where the church was very festively decorated for its congregations, and it was usually packed. Here, for the death of the Pope, Pope Leo's memorial mass, you can see all the draping of the church in memoriam for the Pope. And you can see they erected a mini baldacchino to imitate the one in St. Peter's in Rome for the altar. However, everything was fine until April 18th, 1906. The Jesuits had acquired a debt of well over $1 million to build that new campus in 1880. However, Father MARASCHI had purchased some land over in the East Bay that was very cheap, and then somebody had gifted him a ranch adjacent to it, and that land eventually became prime farming land, which they sold to take the university out of debt and to take the church out of debt. And so finally, by 1905, all debts were paid. For the first time in 50 years, the Jesuits had no debts, and everything was forward-looking. And then the morning of April 18th, 1906, the earthquake did minor damage to the campus. They were actually getting ready for Mass. They had started the 5 o'clock Mass, and the church diaries report a couple of statues fell off their niches, some of the candelabras, toppled, and a little plaster damage, but nothing else. The building held up very well, and so did the classroom buildings. And so the Jesuits that morning continued to offer services all day long. A lot of people thought it was the end of the world. They came to Mass, they came to confession. And then the Jesuit community, which was fairly large at the time, farmed out to other areas of the city where there were people who were injured, in need of the sacraments, in need of consolation, calming down, etc. So the Jesuits assumed they would be fine. However, unfortunately, that morning, one of the women who lived in the area, she had decided to cook breakfast for her family. And she didn't see anything wrong because the earthquake was over, fine, some aftershocks, no big deal. But she went inside to cook ham and eggs for her family for breakfast. And unfortunately, she didn't realize the chimney had been, damaged in the earthquake, and she set fire to her house. But because there was no water in any of the water mains at that point, she actually set fire to the entire neighborhood. And it was just a few blocks away from Saint Ignatius Church. Father Whittle, who was the superior of the Jesuit community, talked about the fact that the fire broke out and the Jesuits saw it coming. They immediately got up with burlap sacks, doused in what water they had, and they tried to extinguish the fire as sparks hit the church tower. It hit the eastern tower, and they were able to put it out. Then later it broke out in that same tower in another spot, and they got that. Finally, it broke out in a spot they could not reach. And they couldn't reach it, and they didn't have a hose, they didn't have water that they could use. And then the eastern tower and the bell tower took fire. And the firemen in the tower and all the other people who were trying to help them concluded it was impossible to save the church. So they immediately went and got the sacred vestments, which had gold threads in them, a lot of the chalices, the different candelabrum, and the school records. And they did what some of the other businesses downtown that morning had decided to do. They dug a trench, and they buried everything in the earth and then put the earth over it to keep it safe. That way it would not be damaged in the fire, would not melt, nothing would happen to it. They would come back later to recover it, which they did. Here's an actual picture of St. Ignatius Church burning, with the towers burning, and you can see the crowds watching. And of course, notice everybody's all dressed up that day, watching, and you can tell the population sort of stunned. Here's an actual picture of church artifacts being brought out to the front and in preparation for being put into the earth to save the school records and the statuary. Here's unfortunately what happened with the Hayes Valley fire. It met the Market Street fire, which then worked its way all the way down to the Ferry Building. Of course, that's what took away the Hearst Building, the Call Building, and the Palace Hotel. So that one ham and eggs fire turned out to pretty much destroy a good portion of the city. This is a famous earth shook and sky burned picture of the 1906 earthquake and fire, and of the fire particularly, and you can see how the fire just engulfed the whole city. Finally, after the earthquake and fire was left, the campus was gutted. And one of the Jesuits that night was able to get a telegraph message out to Father General of the Jesuits in Rome. And he said, St. Ignatius is no more. They had been totally wiped out. They had no money. They were completely busted. And, but they had some generous donors who were willing to lend them money. They decided to build a temporary church and classroom building. And they, again, went to the sand dunes. The Van Ness lot was too expensive, and they were paying taxes on it. They decided, fine, there was no way they could afford those taxes again. Therefore, they would move further out. And they moved out to Hayes Street, Hayes and Schrader and Stanton. And that's current day site across the street from St. Mary's Hospital, the main hospital. And they built a temporary church that opened first, then the classroom building, and they kept adding wings onto it, but they couldn't afford to grade the property, so they would just add a couple of stairs up to the next level, and then a couple of stairs down to the next level, etc. So it was a very haphazard building, and it looked like a shirt factory from the industrial area of San Francisco, because it was hasty and haphazard. And the church they built, unfortunately, only seated 500. It was a small wooden church. It served also as the school auditorium. And this was the furthest west they had ever gone. But it was on a temporary sand dune lot. And the Jesuits, figured, okay, we'll rebuild and, start up again. Unfortunately, there was a discrepancy and a disagreement in the community. The discrepancy had to do with, should we purchase new land here where we're, holding school and the church, or should we just continue to lease this? Or, should we, rebuild the Market Street property? The Italian Jesuits in the community wanted to rebuild on Market Street, and the American Jesuits in the house community said, maybe it's better if we build out here further west in the city. The property taxes will be a lot less. This discussion went on for about 2 years, and finally they decided, okay, we need to find a location for a big church again, and it's probably going to have to be away from Van Ness Avenue. In fact, it probably will need to be out here in this area. And so they finally found the lot, but they actually had a choice between two lots for the current St. Ignatius. Here's a picture of the shirt factory. You can see the little church, and then this sort of haphazard grouping of 4 different buildings next to each other that were added on to through the years. And then there's the sand dune in front, which is the current St. Mary's Hospital land. This is what it looked like from another vantage point. And again, you can see it, fairly inexpensive construction, but served its purposes and served those purposes as a school building up until 1927. Here's what the chapel looked like, which was also the assembly hall. Very, very modest compared to the church on Van Ness Avenue. The Italian Jesuits, I said, wanted to rebuild bigger and better on Van Ness. Father Frieden, who was the American head of the community, wanted to build on the hill above the shirt factory, which is where the current Kendrick Hall Law School is. But when they encountered some of their alums who were architects and engineers, they said that lot would require too much excavation, and that excavation would be more expensive than the church. And furthermore, if there were an earthquake, that wouldn't guarantee the safety of the new church building. They said, what about the lot right up above on Fulton Street? So there was a 2-year discernment process trying to figure out what was the best way to proceed. Finally, the alumni, through various fundraising efforts, letters sent out, etc., found there was a piece of property in front of the Masonic cemetery. Most people think the church is built on the Masonic cemetery property, but in fact that area where the church is was never part of the Masonic cemetery. And so after a 3-year search and bargaining around with landowners, they found the site. It was the western hilltop overlooking San Francisco Bay, the Golden Gate, and the Pacific Ocean. And it became known in real estate terms as Ignatian Heights. They went into major debt. They expected the church would probably cost about $800,000 to build. And since they couldn't afford anything else, they were taking a total loan out on this. They would do without a Jesuit residence. They'd sleep in the classrooms, as they were currently doing down at the shirt factory. And they would not build any college classrooms until somebody donated money. Finally, 17 years later, Bertha Welch donated the money for Welch Hall for a Jesuit residence next to the church. Here you can see the property maps for Laurel Hill Cemetery, Oddfellows Cemetery, Calvary, the Low Mountain property, and then the Masonic Cemetery. But if you notice, the boundaries of the Masonic Cemetery, they do not go all the way up to Fulton Street. And that's the property that the Jesuits were able to purchase, and alumni actually were helpful in securing the land for them. They hired the architects. They were all set to go originally at Grove, Schrader, Cole, and Fulton. Then December 6th, there was a newspaper article announcing they'd struck a deal with the property owners for the current site of Saint Ignatius Church and the adjoining college on Parke and Fulton. The owners were Dr. John Gallagher, and he owned the property on Fulton Street, and Paul Fay, who was a graduate, owned the parcel on Parke. And there was some kind of financial transaction, but it seems that Paul Fay either donated or heavily discounted the property, okay? And so they were all set now to begin building. The current church and the old Jesuit residence, which is now Fromm Hall, were part of that original lot that they purchased. Here's where they blessed the lot, the land right after they purchased it. They had a ceremony to bless it. And they laid a cornerstone. And they took the cornerstone from the 1880 church at the base of the bell tower of the old church, and they put it in what would become the base of the bell tower of the new church. So the current St. Ignatius Church has actually 2 cornerstones, one from the 1880 Hayes and Van Ness campus and one from the current campus. Finally, their architect decided it would be worth the expense to build the church out of steel. Entirely steel construction. This was unusual for the time because it was, number one, very expensive, but number two, no church had been built all with steel in the West Coast. And this probably would mean more expense and a little more time, but as the architect explained to them, this was John Devlin, this would ensure safety in earthquakes in the future because San Francisco is prone to them. So they decided, as part of a fundraising effort, to have, after the steel frame had been erected, they would have a ceremony to bless the new building and to have mass there. And of course, you can see the large crowd that attended. They did different ceremonies this way as fundraisers. Here is the all-steel church structure that is St. Ignatius Church currently today. This was highly unusual. It was also incredibly smart, because in 1989, when there was an earthquake, there was no structural damage to the church at all. And there was no need to retrofit the church, okay, except a minor part under the altar, which I'll explain later. The fact of the matter is, no, it's very, very sturdy in its construction. Here are the original expenses for the church, what they thought it would cost. And, you know, they thought it was maybe 400, 500, well, maybe 700,000, whatever. The fact of the matter is, as they were building, the costs kept going up. The new Cornerstone was put on Parke Street in 1910, and that's the 5th St. Ignatius Church. They actually had a dinner and a dedication of the church in 1914, August 2nd. And here was the new St. Ignatius Church when it first opened. Notice there's nothing by it. It's pretty much its own structure on top of the hill. At that time, this was the tallest thing in San Francisco, because the hilltop was one of the tallest hills, and this is before you had any skyscrapers downtown that went more than 20 stories. This was the largest, tallest structure in the city. You could see it from all over. And they decided to light the towers. And they did that for a couple of reasons. Number one, to show where they were and to be a beacon of light to the city, but also for maritime reasons, because this was the first thing mariners could see in the way into the Golden Gate. So they actually lighted the towers, and that served as a way of the ships knowing the landmark of where they were in relationship to the Golden Gate. Here is one of the first masses at that time in the church. You will notice it is not the altar that is there currently. They didn't have the money to do the sanctuary the way they wanted. They built the church, and then they ran out of funds. Well, actually, they ran out of any more debt that they could apply for. So they never got to paint the church. It was just the original white plaster. They didn't even get to whitewash it. It was just the plaster. And they took the altar from the little church down at Hayes and Schrader, and they moved that up. They literally had the boys one day at lunchtime carry it up the hill. And they simply put that there, built some steps, and that was their high altar. The one thing you can see in here, and unfortunately it's not in color, but the vestments they're wearing are the original gold thread vestments that go back to the 1880 Basilica on Hayes Street. But there's nothing there in any way of decoration. There were no side altars. There was no altar rail. It was a very big, beautiful church, but very plain. Even when they had festive occasions, yes, they would still hang the banners that they had for different occasions. This was a World War I mass. And you can see they copied the same style of decoration that they had used on Market Street in Hayes. But in fact, you can see the plaster is just solid white. There were also no stained glass windows. They had no money. Okay, it was an unpainted, undecorated church. It was dedicated August 2nd, 1914. My father and uncle were altar boys at that first mass. They used all the vestments from the pre-earthquake church and the candelabra. There was no pulpit, no statues, no shrines, no stained glass windows, no side altars. They were out of money. In fact, they were well over $1 million in debt. And the plaster in this church remained unpainted for 48 years. The temporary wooden altar lasted for 35 years. The stained glass windows did not begin until 1937, and they were not completed till 1964. The insurance and the property sale on Van Ness did not provide the expected funds. They had hoped by selling the property in Van Ness and the insurance money they got from the fire that they would be able to pay for all these debts. It turned out, no, it didn't work out. that way. So they had $800,000 plus debt, the equivalent today of $13 million. So building this was an act of faith. You can see here again, this is what the church looked like. And this is 1925, after Welch Hall, a donation by Bertha Welch was given for a Jesuit residence. You can see that next to the Jesuit church. But one of the interesting things about the church is on the Parker Street side, the side facade is very beautifully decorated with pillars, iconic pillars and columns, etc. The campus side is not decorated at all. It's very plain because originally they put that wall up as a facade that would eventually be torn out and a Jesuit residence would be built alongside and join. Unfortunately, when Bertha Welch's estate gave the money, she had passed away, so her children did not give the full amount the Jesuits had hoped for. They had to build a much lesser structure, and therefore they couldn't connect it to the church. Gee, isn't this interesting now in our time in history? In 1917, 1918, and a little bit into 1919, there was a flu epidemic, and there were massive deaths in the United States, not unlike the virus that we are going through now, coronavirus. And the Jesuits at that time, notice people are standing apart here for safety. They moved Mass out to the Parke Street entrance. Since people could not go indoors for Mass and churches were in fact closed, the Jesuits decided to move Mass outdoors and people could safely distance so they would not catch the flu. And the Mass was down here for over a year and a half. Finally, in 1914, one decoration did arrive. They had commissioned these from a family in Italy, an artist there, and he did paintings of the Stations of the Cross. He used his family members as the models for them. And these were the only decoration in the church. They were just recently restored and by his descendants who still have that business. And you can see they're pretty beautiful paintings of the different sequences of the Stations of the Cross that lead to, the Good Friday services. 1918, obviously the flu epidemic and an economic depression and World War I, unfortunately, all combined, and there was a major financial crisis, especially for the Jesuits. Enrollments, were affected by the war. Tuitions had to decrease because people could not pay it, and the debt arose well over $1 million. The banks, when the Jesuits couldn't pay, they threatened foreclosure. So Archbishop Reardon joined with the Alumni Association, and they started a campaign in every church and parish in San Francisco. It was a campaign to save Saint Ignatius Church. And so donations from parishioners all over the archdiocese and alumni of the school saved the church that had spires that inspire. And the Archbishop called the church a symbol for a city rising from the ashes after the earthquake and fire. He wanted to make sure this symbol continued. St. Ignatius Church eventually, was able to raise the funds over a 7-year period. And they were able to get out of that $1 million debt. Unfortunately, they were still in some debt, but minor. So during the 1920s, late 1920s, they were beginning to flourish again. They had a 75th Jubilee celebration in 1930, right after the beginning of the Depression. You can see here a celebration mass for all the alumni and the people of San Francisco that was held on what it was the high school football field. Now it's the USF soccer field, and it was on property down below the church property. Here you can see an aerial view of the church, and next to it, Welch Hall, and next to that, what was built in 1927 is Campion Hall. And then you can see the high school football field on the far side. And then the rest of the area was the former Masonic cemetery. And you can see that's got trees on it, and it's just sort of barren land because the bodies had all been moved out. And then you can see Presentation High School on the corner of Masonic and Turk. And then behind that is the Anza Vista neighborhood, which was the old cavalry cemetery. So this part of town was pretty barren still. And even St. Mary's Hospital had not been fully developed at this time. 1924, as I said, the debts were being reduced down. Mary and Joseph altars were donated. The school did a pageant of youth play that was seen by several thousands of people at the Civic Auditorium. And now that the debts were down, they decided to begin to decorate the church. You have Mary's altar, which is all Carrara marble, beautiful work that was imported from Italy. It has since been redecorated in the sense of refurbished and repolished, and some beautiful paintwork done by by some wonderful donors who had 12 children. So since they had 12 children, they put 12 chairs, 12 candlesticks. Everything was done in multiples of 12 in that altar. St. Joseph's altar is exactly as it was when it was built, with one exception: the stained glass window has been redone and the floor has been redone, because originally the floor was an old wooden floor that was in poor condition. They redid it in the late 1990s. Finally, James Lee, who was a graduate of the school, decided the priests were preaching from the main altar, and it was hard to hear them. This is the days before microphones. They needed a proper pulpit that would act as a sounding board. So he decided to donate the high pulpit, and it was designed in such a way there was a little roof on top of it. And that way the preacher would preach out, the sound would go out to the congregation, up to the roof of the pulpit, and go out to the church as well. So it was acting as the sounding board. And the Jesuits had instituted 3 hours service on Good Friday and the full Holy Week services, so that the church was packed. And it was packed with wonderful preachers who were renowned all over the city. December 31st, 1931, the Jesuits had a tradition of Te Deum services on New Year's Eve. That would usually be around 8:30 at night. And then, of course, people would go home and be very prayerful. No, actually, a lot of times they go out and party. But regardless, the Te Deum was meant to praise God at the end of the year. That night, an electrical fire broke out up above the roof. One of the Jesuit brothers saw it, immediately called the fire department. They responded, and they had to go up to the top choir loft, break a hole through the ceiling, and extinguish the fire. But unfortunately, one of them stepped onto one of the other roof panels, not realizing it was just plaster and was not reinforced in that area, and it gave way. And the ceiling panel, Florence Scannell and William Taylor, both of them fell 40 feet. And Scannell died of his injuries. They fell into the first balcony. Joseph Cronin, the fire department, donated the funds to repair the church and to put a memorial plaque by St. Joseph's altar to honor him and all the firefighters who saved Saint Ignatius Church that night. Otherwise, their church would have gone down because it had no sprinkler system. The first stained glass windows started by the Hardold Wilburton Cummings Studios, who designed them. Wilhelmina Oglethorpe is the first woman to join the Glazers and Glassworkers Union of San Francisco, and she designed the first of the stained glass windows, and she did this for 24 years. And she's designed every one of the windows in the church. You can see there are 10 of the large windows that go on each side of the church. So that's 20 large windows. Plus there are the little circular windows, and then there are a batch in the back of the church. There's a whole legend here on this slide of the different saints that are commemorated, and you can see the years that they were put in. Finally, in the 1940s, they decided it was time to redo the main altar. And Father Bill Dunn, who was president of the university and the high school, and the Harney family, Charles Harney, who were into construction, they decided it was time to do a marble altar. And they designed a very elaborate marble altar with a marble altar railing and a high altar and a baldacchino, which is similar to what you have in Rome, in the Vatican. And this was a 4-year project to install this. And it was a special gift that took from 1948 to 1952 when it was completed. So that began the decoration of the church, hoping to get it completed in time for the 50th anniversary in 1964. But there was a problem. The church leaked. And that was not a new problem. That was an old problem. In fact, right after the church was built, they used a special iron roof that was supposed to be leak-proof. Well, it leaked the first winter. And one of the Jesuit brothers went up there and scrawled in paint, "This roof leaks." Well, it leaked all the way through. They had tried various different drainage systems to try and stop the leakage, but it just was not something that could be easily remedied, and they didn't have the money for a whole new roof. So people who went to St. Ignatius Church were used to going and finding the buckets they used to use for the flowers. There were buckets, and people would just go when it started to rain. They'd go grab a bucket, and everybody knew where the leakage spots were. You just put the bucket down there, it would catch water, and then at the end of the day, one of the Jesuit brothers or group of them would come in, empty the buckets, put them back at night, etc. This, became sort of a ritual that everybody, good-naturedly worked on. Unfortunately, the water damaged the plaster with stains. And some of the stains had some red in them, which meant they were rust stains. So apparently the rust jackets of the framing were not holding as well as they needed to. They did a study in 1953, and they realized that original iron metal roof was not going to last a lifetime, and in fact, they were going to have to do some repair work. If you look at the outside of the church, you can see on the 4 corners in different spots in the church where the brickwork, which is purely decorative, was pulled off. The sheaths that protect the steelwork were repaired, and then the brickwork was reapplied, but unfortunately it doesn't perfectly match. But that's only if you're looking for it, okay? So that was all done at that time. In 1962, Father Charles DeLay, who was head of the Jesuit community, decided to complete the design work. He commissioned painters to come in and create a design for the church that would feature all the beautiful architectural work of the original architect. And so it picked up a nickname because there was so much gold leaf applied. And this was the same time the Fox Theater on Market Street was being torn down. Some people nicknamed it Father DeLay's Fox Theater. Others nicknamed it the Jesuit Opera House. But it was completed 49 years after the original design of the interior. All the stained glass windows were completed. All the shrines, the side altars were all completed. Everything was finally ready. And it was done in sections. So the first sections to be completed were the side sections. And as they were unveiled, people marveled at the architectural beauty of the church that had pretty much not been featured because it was all white plaster. And the baldacchino was also painted at the same time to create a spectacular effect. At that time, they moved the organ from the upper organ loft down to behind the main altar, behind all those kneeling angels at the second level. They put all the organ pipes back there. And this is what the church looked like for, its 50-year golden anniversary, 1964. They also finally got the statue of Saint Ignatius in its niche up at the top of the church. There were theater productions that were done at that time. Father James Dempsey was director of drama at USF. He decided to do a production of Murder in the Cathedral using the original gold vestments of the church on the altar. And you can see some of the actors in the production there. And then finally, to complete every part of this, project of decorating the church, PG&E approached Father Charles Geoghegan in 1988. And they had a proposition. They wanted to show the supervisors and the mayor what it would be like to light up a landmark like the Europeans did with their landmarks. Why not do that with San Francisco's beautiful civic center? But the city was not interested. So they approached the Jesuits because they had the biggest landmark and the tallest spot in the city. And that was Saint Ignatius Church. And they said, look, we'll do this for free. We will create a system, a lighting system that will light up not only the two spires of the church, but we will light the entire outside of the church, so it will be a shining beacon to the whole city. And it will be, a special advertisement for the university and the church. Jesuits agreed. The date chosen to do the lighting was October 20th, 1989. Unfortunately, something intervened. On the October 17th was the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and the entire city was blacked out. And it was blacked out because of safety precautions. And what they did was gradually, one block by block, starting with the beach, PG&E gradually, after they did their safety checks, would restore electricity to one street after another, after another, after another. They knew they couldn't light up downtown. They knew that there were parts of the mission they couldn't light up. They knew the marina was definitely out of the question. So they wanted to show something that would give people hope. And they basically decided to co-opt the original dedication of the lighting of Saint Ignatius Church, and they decided to do it on the night of October 18th. And so they did. And all of a sudden, Saint Ignatius Church was lit, and everybody in the city could see it. It was a sure sign that San Francisco had made it through another earthquake that tried to stop things. Here's an outside view of the university at night with the church all lit up. And then in 1994, the Archbishop decided to re-parish St. Ignatius. He said, I really want to see St. Ignatius Church become a parish. And so he asked Father Geoghegan, who was a longtime San Francisco native, to become the pastor. And he would become the first pastor in the 20th century. And he began immediately a campaign to replace the roof where there were still leaks, to fix the dome, which was still a problem, and to commission new carpeting and flooring for the aisles, and to include upgrades to the electrical and heating systems, and to redecorate some of those side altars that had fallen into disrepair. Here's an example of St. Ignatius Church being used for both the high school and the college graduations, and you can see it becomes a spectacular setting for these events. And you can see the use of wonderful banners down the different pillars to, again, embrace people with the grandeur of the church. In 2014, Father Bonfilio, Greg Bonfilio, had been appointed pastor. He and Pastor Emeritus Father Geoghegan were the only two living SI pastors. They were pastors 3 and 4. They celebrated the centennial of St. Ignatius Church, and they gathered parishioners, graduates from SI, USF, Jesuits from all over California, Loyola Guild, all the different groups came in to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 100th anniversary of the church and the 50th of the redecoration. You can see the massive group of Jesuits and some of the archbishop and bishops who celebrated that wonderful anniversary. Christmas becomes a special time at St. Ignatius Church with all living Christmas trees. Those are all live trees that are lighted. Beautiful use of the poinsettias. And it becomes a destination for a lot of Catholics to come to, and actually for tourists to come to during the Christmas season. And here we come back to our beginning slide, where you see Saint Ignatius Church with its spires lit up at night that become a shining beacon to the whole western part of San Francisco, to remind people in this city of the beautiful city they live in, but also of its ability to rebuild. Just as the Jesuits rebuilt their church 5 times through the history of the city, so has San Francisco had to constantly rebuild itself and reimagine itself and find ways to inspire after tough times. And of course, as we're going through the coronavirus, now we're reminded we have to do the same thing.